So Mr. Freeze is the most tragic villain in all of Batman's rogue gallery, but he's also an incredible villain, and this story perfectly encapsulates his character. So this is Batman One Bad Day, and this is the Mr. Freeze story. For those of you guys who don't know what this is, Batman One Bad Day are a series of Batman comics that are all standalone. None of them tie into the others, there's no cohesive story, but each one focuses on Batman facing off against one of his villains over the course of a single day. Of course, the title refers to the Killing Joke, the origin of the Joker, and the idea that all it takes is one bad day to drive somebody crazy. But what this does here is this opens up with the Narrows in Gotham City. But for those of you guys who are unfamiliar with the Narrows, this is of course a pretty poor area of Gotham. There's a lot of crime there, depending on what era of Gotham City the particular comics are referencing. And in the middle of these people walking along and singing Christmas carols, they're suddenly attacked by a guy called Meek. Now, Meek is a character that was established in Batman Volume 2, issue number 34, as part of the New 52. He's not overly important. He's just kind of one of these irredeemable villains, a serial killer essentially, and that he just kind of travels along and just attacks unsuspecting victims in Gotham. Of course, Batman shows up on the scene alongside Robin and they incapacitate this guy and then string him up and wait for the cops. But there's a really interesting conversation that goes on here. And this is one of the reasons why, as we go through this, you guys will find this story very much feels like an episode of Batman the Animated Series. Because Robin asked the question, right? Did we use the carolers as bait? And the response of Batman is they were never in any real danger. And it's cool to see that because he says, I knew the Meek was close and he would hate the joy the carolers would bring and another family would die while we waited for the next night. He's one of the irredeemable ones. It's a cool conversation here because Robin doesn't necessarily believe it, right? He's like, do you really believe that? And the response of Batman is yes. One of the cool things that I love about Batman One Bad Day is you don't really see Batman the way you traditionally see him, which is everybody can be saved. And it's not to say that he's just like this, wearing his heart on his sleeve, hippie type of guy, some spiritual YouTuber telling everybody to practice mindfulness. It's one of these things where he really has villains where he looks at them and says, there is no saving these guys. And honestly, because of my no killing rule, I don't just execute them. We hand them over to the justice system and everything goes from there. But there are some villains out there that cannot be saved. And one of the things that he talks about here is that Mr. Freeze is not one of them. Now, in order to kind of contact Victor Freeze here, what he ends up doing is going underground as Matches Malone. Now, for those of you guys who are unfamiliar with Matches Malone, Matches is basically Batman's like ear to the ground persona, because most of you guys know him as Bruce Wayne, right? The billionaire guy who just runs around with a whole bunch of rich folks and bangs super hot chicks, and like that's basically it. But Matches Malone is where he goes into like the criminal underworld. He makes up stories, and I wouldn't go so far as to say that he engages in actual crimes, although historically there have been stories where he committed crimes as Matches Malone in order to justify his role as that character. But to the point about Victor Freeze, there's this conversation between Robin and Alfred where Robin says that Batman thinks that bad guys cannot change. And if that's true, what's the point of Arkham? Like, what's the point of us? And the response of Alfred is, we must have hope that the hearts of men can change, especially during the holidays. It's a really cool thing here because when it comes to the idea of Batman and his difference with Robin, Robin as a character, especially when you're talking about Dick Grayson, is an idealist, right? I mean, I wouldn't go so far as to say he's naive, but he really does believe in the best of people. And over the course of the Batman comics and even just DC as a whole, he's kind of like the brightest and best of them in a lot of ways, second only to Superman, right? And it's one of those coolest elements of his characters. And it's one of the reasons why he stood the test of time in DC Comics for so long. That and the fact that he was awesome when he was on the Teen Titans. But Batman chimes in here and he says there is one out there now that could change with some help. And so it kind of takes Alfred off guard. He was like, okay, this is a little weird because did Batman really say that a criminal could change? It's really, again, kind of Alfred busting the balls of Batman, but he says yes. He says, Victor Freeze, I think he can be redeemed. Some of Batman's villains have a bad day. Some have long emergencies that end in tragedies. He was a man of science who refused to accept the cards that life had dealt him. In the end, he was a man born not of cruelty or accident, but of heartbreak. His specialty was maintaining extremely cold temperatures for long periods of time. There are endless applications in medicine, most notably in transporting vaccines long distances in developing countries. When his wife Nora fell ill, he applied it to stop time for her. What happens next depends on who you talk to. The Gotham City Police Department went in hard, and the arrest was botched. The experimental solution escaped containment, and lives were lost. Victor's was spared, and Nora's still hangs in the balance. And Mr. Freeze was born, right? The entire exposure to the experimental chemical that fundamentally altered the structure of his body, right? So he's basically adapted to cold, and he cannot stay in warm temperatures for any real measure of time. But the fact is, like, it's a little bit of an origin, given to us for his character. And truth to tell, it's pretty well done. Like, you don't really need a whole lot more than that. I guess you could go into detail about the nature of the chemical, but it really just kind of does its job. And so following that, you have a little back and forth between Alfred and Batman, where it's like, hey man, do I need to pop you in the face one good time in order to give you a shiner and make the whole thing look legitimate? But at the end of the day, they choose not to, right? Basically Batman puts on some alcohol as a kind of cologne to give the allure and everything that he's a criminal. And then he ends up showing up to this bar called Fingers Joint. The cool thing here is that when he gets in there, because Batman has operated as matches Malone for quite some time, with the criminal underworld being completely unaware of who he actually is, he's kind of built up a reputation for himself. And so that's why when he comes in, he says, took down a nice score and I forgot who I owe what to, so a round on me. And that's true, right? I mean, if you ever want to make things right with somebody in a bar, buy him a beer. That'll usually fix most all problems, right? It's a kind of a cool little thing, right? Just a deal between men. But the fact is here, he kind of goes through and talks some stories and different things like that, but he also lets it slip that he's looking for Victor Freeze. But he doesn't really do it in overt terms. You can't do that in the criminal underworld. You can't walk in and say, hey, has anybody seen Victor Freeze? Because people are going to be like, why? Right? It's just the wrong kind of question to ask. And so what he does is he talks about a heist that had kind of gone bad, where basically they ended up knocking over a tanker truck that was supposed to have oil, but instead was hauling liquid nitrogen. This perks the ears of one of the guys who's there, and he's like, give me a taste of your truck and I'll tell you how to find Mr. Freeze, right? My ex is rolling with him these days. And that gives Batman everything he needs, because following that, what you end up doing is switching over to Victor Freeze himself and a truck heist that's going on, in the sense that like these guys are driving down the road and then there's this huge splatter and they're basically blinded and all that kind of cool stuff, and the vehicle goes careening off and it basically lands inside of a tunnel under a bridge. And that's when these two drivers realize Victor Freeze is here. Now, one of the coolest elements about Victor Freeze's character, both in this story and in the Batman mythos overall, is that while he is a tragic villain, because again, as it was stated, he's not looking for money or power, he doesn't feel like he was weak in life and is trying to establish his dominance in the criminal underworld in order to convince himself that he's important. Everything he does is for the purpose of trying to find a way to cure his wife. The reality here is he kind of got lost in it all, and he is ruthless. I mean, he is ridiculously ruthless. Truth to tell, I would argue that Mr. Freeze can be, and oftentimes is, every bit as cunning as the Joker. The difference between the two of them is that Mr. Freeze is very, very intelligent. The Joker's insane, right? So his insanity is what governs his decision making. But Freeze takes no prisoners, right? No quarters given. And that's why he arrives here on the scenes and he says, gentlemen, the next decision you make will determine the course of your lives. Stay in there and be burned by the cold, or run for your lives. It's amazing, right? Because it's like, this is happening. You're not going to talk me out of it. Nothing's going to change my mind. This is absolutely going down. Now, of course, he's also here alongside Frostbite. As far as I'm aware, in DC Comics, this character is really new to this story. The only Frostbite that I'm aware of that's associated with DC is Leon Carver from the old Gen 13 comics back in the 90s. It was a guy who could basically absorb ambient heat and then basically turn it into like cold energy and shoot it back at people. So this really feels like a new character. And honestly, they're not that important here, right? In the sense you kind of see him for a little bit, but that's basically it. What ends up happening is that almost immediately as this heist goes down, Batman shows up. Now, the funny thing here is that Frostbite is a little concerned about Batman, not really terrified or anything like that, but Mr. Freeze has no fear whatsoever. He literally says, you have nothing to be afraid of. It's just a big rat. And so you get Batman who's kind of standoffish, because Batman also realizes the threat that Mr. Freeze poses and how ruthless Mr. Freeze can be. So that's why he says, like, like, keep your hands off your freeze gun, you're not faster than me. And where these guys believe that Batman's there to save them, this story also kind of seems to take place in the relative early days of Batman's mythos. Not really year one per se, but still like before the Joker seemingly arrives on the scene, at least in this particular story, assuming the Joker would ever show up at any particular point in time. I say that because one of the guys is really terrified of Batman and is like, he's not a hero, man. Like, he dropped a guy into a vat of acid at Ace Chemical, obviously an allusion to the Joker in this particular story. But again, like, one of these guys just kind of says, Mr. Freeze, take the money, bail, you know, we don't really need it or anything like that, right? Like, this is just part of doing business in Gotham City. And Batman kind of chimes in and says, I'm not here on business. This is personal. The response of Freeze, nothing is personal with me. And so Batman, of course, ends up throwing his batarang at Mr. Freeze. It offers some measure of a distraction, and then a scuffle ensues between the two of them, but Freeze gets the upper hand on Batman. And this is where things get cool, because if you don't look at Mr. Freeze as a villain of the week, and you look at him as a very tragic guy who's always doing these things to try to find some way to cure his wife, then in turn, it really changes the landscape, right? The conversation between the two, where Victor Freeze says, what could be more personal between us, right? The response of Robin is, it was my idea. We wanted to do something nice here for your wife, Nora. That stops Victor Freeze on the spot. Now, he does go to pull his gun, right? You know, like a villain would traditionally do, but ultimately chooses to hear them out, right? And of course, he ends up sending Frostbite away, but Batman says, like, my car is parked down the road. Let's go for a drive. So you end up having Batman, Robin, and Mr. Freeze all riding together in the Batmobile, which I just need to throw it out there. This looks amazing. Never in my life have I ever needed to see Batman and Mr. Freeze riding in the Batmobile together. It's everything I hoped it would be. But Batman basically says, right, the recession left labs all over the place, basically mothballed, no real crew of any kind that are working in there. They're effectively shut down and all but named, right? He says, we turn confiscated drug money into lab time for you. There have been major advances into Nora's condition. Before her condition can be treated, she needs to be safely removed from the ice. Now, of course, Freeze comments on the fact that he worked here as an undergrad at one point, but the fact is that Batman says everything was digitized after the incident, which initially modified your body's structure. I have a copy on a local server for you. I've also taken the liberty of hosting all your science journals and all the new research in your field since you've been gone. We can bring Nora here. And that's where Freeze says, no, right? She's safe where she is. I will work here, and if I succeed, then I will bring her here. What do you get out of this? Because in the criminal underworld, it's always tit for tat, right? Everything's transactional. I do for you, you do for me. Nobody ever does anything out of essentially kindness. And Robin kind of chimes in and says, Batman doesn't really get anything. Like, the only thing he gets is to not be able to beat you up. So I don't really know if he's getting anything out of this. But following that, what you do is switch over to this journal entry that Nora had written to Victor before everything went sideways and she was cryogenically frozen. And it's this beautiful letter that, again, really shows how tragic the situation is, where she says, Victor, I hope you're really listening to me now. I know you don't like to be criticized, but I hope you take what I'm about to tell you in the spirit in which it is intended. You have that great big heart, but it's unguarded. Things that should roll off your back seem to wound you grievously. Sometimes I worry that you want to live your life that way. Moving from one grudge to the next, it's not a life worth living, Victor. I'm worried it will lead only to loneliness for you. There is bad in the world, but there is also good. And you're going to have to get out there and experience all of it. I'm sorry it didn't go our way. It wasn't heading in the right direction before my diagnosis. I know you don't mean it, or I hope you don't, but sometimes I get the feeling that you're mad at me. Is it because when you disappear into work, my life goes on? My therapist says she wonders if you think time stops for me when we're apart. And now we're going to be apart forever. And I want my last gift to you to be insight into yourself. And she says, your temperature runs so hot that it intimidates people. Victor, it intimidated me. Try to run cooler. Let that big brain flex and protect that heart. take people as they come. Now we need to say goodbye. And this is only just one part of the tragedy of it, right? It's only one part of how sad this gets. But the idea here is that Victor ultimately cannot thaw his wife out. He can't really bring her back so she can be moved. More so than that, he can't find a way to cure her of her illness. And so what he ends up doing is actually kind of crawling into this bed. And that's when you really get the tragedy of it all, because you flash back to when he was laying in bed with his wife when she was succumbing to her illness. And she asks, "Are you hearing me, Victor? It's time to talk about what comes next." And Victor says, no. Mr. Freeze is really struggling here. He's struggling with the fact that his wife is dying, and he refuses to accept the fact that it's true. And so he says, science is so close to helping you, you just need a bridge. And she says, no, right? Of course, there's a knock on the door. Mr. Freeze answers, and he says, she doesn't need you now. And where the question from Nora is, who was it? Victor just says, oh, it was just some nurses, and that's essentially it. And so Nora's sad here because she's like, I was hoping that our friends would come and visit or something along those lines. But she says, promise me, Victor, use that big brain to change the world. Don't fixate on losing me. Leave all this trouble behind and spread your wings. You're better for having loved and lost. And it's this incredibly beautiful moment here because in his frustration and all of his pain and his sadness, Victor freaks out and trashes the lab, and the whole place just gets blown to pieces, and the picture of his wife gets set on fire. But it's not a lashing out of rage and anger. It's emotional pain, right? His wife cannot be cured. She cannot be thawed. For all the good it is, she might as well be on Mars, right? I mean, there's no real way for him to be around her, to be near her, to hold her or touch her in any meaningful way. And so Batman and Robin, of course, arrive on the grounds of this whole situation. They kind of do a little bit of poking through and so on and so forth. But in the end, Batman's just like, there's something that I need to go look into because I feel like this is going to be an incredibly long night. And so what happens is his journey and his investigation leads him to a guy by the name of David Lookner. Of course, David was one of the friends that Nora had. And that where Batman says, like, I'm sorry to interrupt your holiday, I have a few questions and then I'll be gone. Batman says, I've reviewed the news clips from the memorial services for Nora Freeze. You were one of her friends. The response of David is, yes, I was. It's just obscene what happened to her. And so he says about that, right? The whole idea that the disease seemed to take her too soon. He says he was her first disease, right? Referring, of course, to Victor. He wouldn't even let her see her friends at the end. My wife and I went, and so did Nora's other friends from work. You know what he said to us? She doesn't need you now. She's been robbed of a dignified end, tragically ironic given her living will. And Batman didn't know about that. Didn't really know that she had a living will at all. It was never submitted in any real way. And so ultimately Batman basically takes back off again. And what he does is he realizes all this is going to lead to a direct confrontation with Mr. Freeze himself. And in order to take precautions for this, he's basically got, fire retardant and different things like that, which would basically allow him to douse himself in fire in order to overcome the freezing capabilities of Mr. Freeze and kind of allow himself to fight as he normally would. But you basically end up on this, frozen ship out there at the docks. And when Batman arrives on the scene, he says, we know you're here, Freeze, and we know everything. And he says, is that right? And that's when Batman tells Robin, like, get behind me. Because one of the things that he knows here is that because they're out in the middle of nowhere, right? This ship out there in the water, or at least the frozen ice, that Mr. Freeze is going to be fighting to kill. He's not going to be holding back, right? So he has no qualms with killing Batman or killing Robin, right? It doesn't really matter to him at all. And so the reality here is Robin is in the most danger that he could probably be in this particular situation. More so than that, while Robin is incredibly capable, he could actually prove to be a hindrance to Batman. Because not only is Batman trying to find a way to defeat Mr. Freeze, he's also worried about Robin and making sure nothing happens to him. And so that's where Batman chimes in and kind of taunts Freeze a little bit. And he says, when your wife became ill, she wanted a dignified end. That was her living will request. You robbed her of that. You stole time from her. Did you even try to get her out of the ice? And the response of Freeze is, how dare you? The day that she was diagnosed was the worst day of my life. And the response of Batman is, maybe that's true, maybe not. I don't much care. here. It seems to me that Nora's worst day was not her diagnosis, it was marrying you. And this is all designed to goad Freeze, right? Where he responds and says, who are you to judge me? At least I tried for a normal life. And that's where Batman says, like, the deck's giving way, it's about to collapse and all that kind of stuff. Victor Freeze sends him flying down, and of course, Robin ends up jumping into the conflict. For the most part, Robin's able to hold his own, but the fight between the two ends up leading them down to where Nora is, right? Where she's currently being held by Victor Freeze. More so than that, he actually has an almost kind of trophy room, so to speak, experiments, right? Birds, a dog, different things like that are all really just kind of here. And one of the things that he says, right? He says, don't look at her, right? And the response of Robin is, I just wanted to help her. There's no reason that she has to stay this way. The response of Victor is, Nora loved nature. Perhaps I'll give her another bird to keep her company. One of the things that's being established here is that Victor Freeze, on some level, has kind of given up on the idea of saving his wife. He's given up on the idea of bringing Nora back. He has full on become that villain. But notice this, it's not because of just some sick, twisted desire to be a bad guy. On some level it is. And in fact, he even says as much when he's talking to Robin, right? He's like, I'll let you in on a little secret. Do you know why my life is the way that it is? Because I like it the way that it is. But one of the things that you'll notice over the course of the story, particularly when he was dealing with the fact that Nora was basically dying, it was 100% denial. It was pushing his humanity away in order to replace it with what he believed to be the better version of himself to cope with his own situation. And so this whole situation with him is just a man coping with grief and putting barriers around himself. That was the message that his wife was giving him, right? Do not shut yourself out from the world, or you will become a horrible, twisted person, which is what he has become. When Robin says, I don't understand, what about her? He says, since you asked, you know what I enjoy about our relationship today? We don't fight anymore. She's not out spending my money, and I don't sit alone in an empty house wondering who she's out with or when she'll be home all the time. It's insecurity is what that reeks of. But the reality here is all he's focusing on is the negative aspects of the relationship that he had with her, the terrible things that happened and the terrible ways he felt, instead of thinking about all the love that the two of them shared. That's the important thing. That's what really matters the most. When you're old and gray and you're like 85 years old sitting on your rocking chairs, rocking back and forth, sure, there's been some bad times, but you focus on the good memories, right? You focus on the good things that happen. And so again, he's very much keeping himself guarded. And so in this conversation between them, of course, Robin tells Batman, hey man, get down here as soon as you can, so on and so forth. And he tells Victor Freeze, this is not what that big brain is for. And that triggers a thought in Victor Freeze's mind, right? Where he's like, why did you say that? It is a little bit cringy. It gives me like Batman, Superman, Dawn of Justice vibes, that terrible Zack Snyder movie. But the fact is, like, it chimes in a kind of memory, because what you do is you pick up with this moment where Victor's driving his wife home from the hospital in order to basically conduct the procedure on her that will freeze her, right? And she asks, like, is whatever you're doing going to help me, or is it going to help you? He doesn't really say anything here, but in this conversation when they're driving, because Victor Freeze is so closed off, because he's become so cold, because he really has shut himself off to his own humanity and to the human race as a whole, she says, this is not what that big brain is for. It's like the last thing his wife said to him. And that's why it triggers that memory in his head, because it almost kind of snaps him back to his normal self for a moment. But again, he kind of gives back in, puts those barriers back up, and goes back to being the tragic villain that we all know. Ultimately, the deck can't save, Nora, or at least it can't keep her protected because of the fact that Victor Freeze is freezing everything up, and ultimately it all just kind of gives way. But Robin actually saves Nora, right? He just like shoots off, right, one of those grappling hooks and then attaches it to the crate that Nora's on and essentially like keeps her aerated so she doesn't fall down and the whole thing doesn't get destroyed and all that kind of stuff. And so following that, like, Victor Freeze goes to like attack Batman, but it's really just kind of a very weak and momentary attack. He does manage to like stab him a little bit, but Batman has like this really amazing human moment with Victor Freeze where he says, she deserved better than this. You didn't want to share her with the world ever. You never wanted her to be out there with the world. You wanted her to stay at home with you all the time. And that's why you keep her frozen, because now you can keep her with you everywhere. You don't have to share her with the world. She is yours and yours alone, just like when she was living. But much the same way as what's happening now with her dying. While she wasn't dying until she became ill, she was dying because you were keeping her away from everybody. You were keeping her from the things that she needed most. And he says, and there was never a way out of this, was there? her, right? There was never a way to thaw her out and to somehow cure her. That was never going to happen. There is no saving Nora-freeze. And so ultimately, Victor just sort of gives in, right? He allows himself to be arrested. But there's this incredibly fantastic moment here because he thanks Robin for saving Nora, but he says, it's true, I didn't free Nora, but I might have been able to crack an older problem. You'll have to be the judge. Come closer. And he says, I cannot unlock Nora from the ice, at least not yet, but I did make a discovery. And he whispers the discovery to Robin. We don't find out what it is here, but it's really, really cool. Now, of course, Victor Freeze is basically taken to jail. And then, of course, Batman and Robin go back and they kind of keep Nora in stasis where she stays perpetually frozen due to just all kinds of energy sources with redundant energy sources. So basically, her cryogenic stasis will never run out of power, right? She'll stay frozen seemingly forever. But what you end up doing is you pick up with Victor Freeze at Blackgate Penitentiary. And of course, he goes out into the yard because it's cold and does this whole thing. But you find out what it is that he told Robin. It says your top story on this frigid New Year's morning is a breakthrough in cryogenics that was anonymously gifted to Wayne Enterprises. The breakthrough would allow all four corners of the globe to receive vaccines and medicines that previously required powered refrigeration. The research is being made open source, and that's not a bad way to ring in the new year. So yes, Victor Freeze could not save Nora, and yes, Victor Freeze is tossed in Blackgate for his criminal acts, but the last great thing he did here was give the world free energy forever. It's one of the coolest things because you get this small little moment where his wife says, promise me, Victor, right? A kind of memory where she says that you'll use your big brain to change the world. Leave this trouble behind and spread your wings. But that's the story, guys. It is beautiful. It's probably one of the greatest Victor Freeze stories that I think I've ever read in my entire life. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments section. Let me know if you want me to cover more because these are really, really cool. And I will catch you all later. Peace.